Of course, a plane. Literally the second I start to film. Hello, my precious everyone. Welcome back to Wow Mel. I have my fall stuff up. Also, I totally forgot I had this microphone, so I didn't use it for like 5 videos. Those who know me know I love Dungeons and Dragons, and I feel like now more than ever, people are really starting to take an interest in it. It makes me super happy that it's spreading more because Dungeons and Dragons has brought a ton of joy into my life and has honestly really helped me in a lot of ways. But it can seem incredibly intimidating to get into. It's kind of like famously known for it being very complicated and involving math and just being like super nerdy and having a steep learning curve. But I'm here to break down some of the important things to consider before starting to play Dungeons and Dragons to see if it might be a good fit for you and your life, because there honestly are a lot more things to think about before you start than you might realize. If there are just constant planes in the background of this video, forgive me, I'm not going to just continually pause what I'm doing because we're already at 3 planes and we're not even 6 minutes in. Initially, I was going to break this video up into like the pros of D&D and the cons of D&D, but there were so many like intermingling pros and cons that instead I'm going to divide it into subsections of things you should consider before you start playing and sort of talk about the good and the bad parts of each. These subsections are rules, time, money, party, and purpose. They might not make sense initially, but once I go into things you should consider for each of them, I promise it'll make some more sense. First of all is rules. If you're new to D&D, to be completely honest, the learning curve is kind of steep. It's pretty commonly joked about for being needlessly complicated and involving math. And I know I understand the rules now, so this is a biased perspective, but it's not that bad. It gets a little complicated if you're like calculating enemies' challenge ratings and stuff, but if you're new to D&D, this probably isn't something you're doing anyways. There are lots of rules, but another good part about Dungeons and Dragons is you don't have to use all of them. The DM can choose what to use, and a lot of rules are kind of specific and probably won't even come up anyways. And no one is expecting you to know all the rules. Sometimes it just helps to know where to be able to go to refer to them. There are also multiple editions of Dungeons and Dragons, so you should definitely consider what type of edition you want to play because they will have different rules. But the most recent edition, and I think since it's the most recent, it's also the most commonly played one nowadays, is 5th edition. You'll see it written as 5e a lot. So if you're new to D&D, that's definitely one I recommend doing. You'll find a lot of resources on how to learn it and things like that, and I think you'll have a much easier time finding other people who know how to play 5e. To learn the rules, I know a lot of people are getting into D&D from watching D&D shows and podcasts like Critical Role, so that can already give you sort of a background on how to play it, but I really recommend reading the player's handbook, or at least like part of it. I know it can be pretty long. There's also a D&D starter set, which includes like a more condensed version of the rules. It has a pre-written adventure, I think pre-made character sheets, maybe even some dice. I know they have like some more stuff in there. That's definitely something you should look into, especially if you're more of a first-time DM, because I think starting out with a pre-made adventure can take a lot of the weight off and help you learn what a campaign and a session should look like and what sorts of notes you should have prepared. Another way to learn the rules of D&D, of course, there is YouTube and all sorts of videos about it. You can also use D&D Beyond. They have a ton of information on there, and they even have a free way to create characters, and they honestly automate the process and make it so simple to pick up. You can make a character literally in minutes on D&D Beyond, so if you're a newbie, I definitely recommend it. The best way to start learning all the rules of D&D though is to start playing. I know that's probably kind of a frustrating thing for me to say, but it really is. It's so much easier when you're playing to figure out what you do understand and what you don't, and then when something comes up that you don't understand, you can either ask someone about it or look it up and figure it out from there. And then kind of playing it that way will help you fill in the gaps in your knowledge. Also, if you're really new to D&D and you really don't know the rules at all, I do recommend you try joining a group as a player first Starting out as a DM is definitely possible and you can still totally do it, but I find it's a lot easier to start out as a player because there's just less you have to prepare and less you have to know. And it helps doubly if you're starting out as a player and you're in a campaign with a DM who knows D&D and you're with other players who know D&D. Sometimes that's not always an option, but I definitely think that's a very beginner-friendly way to go about it. It's what I did. I started out in a group that the DM knew how to play D&D already and about half the players knew, and so it created a really nice mix of, I didn't feel like the only one who didn't know how to play, so I wasn't like embarrassed about it, and then I also had people who knew how to play so they could help me out a lot, and I honestly picked it up pretty quickly. Of course, it's going to be a little bit harder or easier to understand depending just on who you are as a person, but I don't think you should let the rules potentially scare you off. However, it is still something to consider. Another aspect you need to consider is time. For a lot of people, but especially the DM, D&D is actually a pretty big time commitment. And this goes doubly if you don't know the rules, because it will take you extra time to catch on and learn them. But even if you know the rules, sessions themselves can be pretty long too. Although there are ways to make it more manageable. My group used to do sessions that would last about 4 to 6 hours and they would happen weekly. For a lot of people, this is way too much, and even for my group, as we've all gotten jobs and started to become busier, we're starting to change it to every other week. You can do it as often as it works for you and your group. You can do it multiple times a week, once a week, every other week, every 3 weeks, every month, or some people just do it whenever they can squeeze one in because sometimes that's all that works for people. And sessions don't have to be nearly as long as mine are either. I know people whose sessions go on way longer, but they can be a handful of hours, even just like 2. But I think the tricky part is honestly just lining up schedules. And I think this is probably something that breaks most D&D groups up. So if you're going to get into D&D and you're looking for a party, this is something I recommend you talk to them about basically as soon as possible. Because if your schedules don't line up, you really can't play D&D together. Sometimes someone can't catch a session like that, and that's very common, and life gets in the way, and sometimes someone will have to drop out. But sometimes like entire groups just can't make it work. I have actually a first-hand experience with this. I am technically part of this campaign because we haven't given up on it yet. I hope we don't. Our session 0 was on September 30th, and since then we have not had another session. We've never actually started with session 1 because our schedules don't line up. In fact, the only reason we were able to do the session 0 in the first place was because I had to skip out on one of my other obligations just so we were able to meet. And so if you're trying to get into D&D and you found a potential group, you should right off the bat make sure you at least have some time that you guys can probably consistently meet up, or people have very flexible schedules so they're able to kind of work around it. It is unfortunate, but you should get that stuff out of the way in the beginning, because if you found a party who might work with you but then your schedules don't line up, you can split up from them and look for a new group without getting yourself too invested. Like, I am super invested in this campaign, so I really don't want to give up. I hope it works out. That is definitely something to consider, whether you have the time for D&D in your life, time to create a character, time to dedicate weekly or bi-weekly or whatever it is. Definitely much bigger time commitment for the DM. And yeah, make sure everyone's on the same page with time right off the bat. That's one of those things, unfortunately, can just break a group apart. The third thing you need to consider is money. There are actually many ways to play D&D for completely free. Using the basic options on D&D Beyond is free, which means you can create a character for free, roll dice for free, and if you're using maps, you can just draw them out on paper and use tags. Maybe don't use tags, that's kind of dangerous. You can just use random things around your house as like minis for the character when you need to keep track of location for battle. There are also a lot of free resources online, including free monster snap blocks and actually like whole adventures, but it is very likely you'll wind up spending something on D&D. For beginners, you probably don't want to shell out a bunch of money. until you know whether or not you actually like D&D. At the very least, you'll probably want a set of D&D dice for you to roll. If not more, they're kind of addicting. I personally find it really helpful to have at least a physical copy of the player's handbook. There are also online copies if you're not interested in reading physical copies. You might also get roped into making a mini. The books themselves are kind of expensive too. You can get them from anywhere to like from $20 to like $60. And then if you get terrain pieces and erasable maps, it all really starts to add up. Good news about this is you'll slowly start to add to your collection. I started out buying a mini for my character, and I was actually gifted a set of dice from my first DM, so I'm pretty sure that's the only thing I bought. But as I realized I really enjoyed D&D, I wanted to learn more about the rules, and so then I got the player's handbook, and then I started thinking that I would be interested in DMing myself one day, so then I got the DMG and the monster manual and then a DM screen, and from there I've just slowly started adding more books into my collection. So when you do it like slowly, it really is just like $30 investments at a time. Otherwise, another manageable way to do it is to split costs among your group, and you can also remember that there are so many things out there for free. I don't think money should be an object for D&D either, but it can be for some people, and in the likely event that you do wind up enjoying D&D, you might want to be a little bit prepared to spend some money on it. The fourth thing to consider is the party. Sorry if the lighting changed, the sun was like starting to set, so I had to open the window more. For a lot of people, I think finding a party can be the trickiest part of getting into D&D. So if you just want to ask your friends like, hey, do you play D&D? Or hey, are you interested in learning to play D&D with me? I think that is actually a really viable option. I actually had a friend who was just like, do you want to play D&D? And I was like, yes, and then he taught me. There are also other ways to find a group. I'm sure there are like Reddit forums for this. They have like Discord groups as well, where you can get matched with like a dungeon master. Because of the technology we have now, you can play D&D even if like you don't live by anyone who plays it, because you can get matched with people all around the world. Of course, this can lead to time zone issues, so it might be a little harder to find a consistent schedule, but as long as you're willing to play online, I think it's actually quite easy to find a group. If you're interested more so in playing in person, you can go to your local game store. A lot of them run D&D nights. I think a lot of them do it like Adventurers League style, where it's just a DM and then every week there's kind of a different group of people like who winds up turning up. So you can ask your local game store things about that and likely get hooked up with a group. I know some libraries actually run D&D programs. High schools might do it, and I know colleges, I've actually asked friends if they have D&D groups there. A lot of colleges totally do, so if you're a college student, that's something you can definitely look into. I have heard stories of some workplaces that actually run D&D groups. And also like public recreation centers, sometimes they run programs. Like if you're curious, just looking around locally in places that run programs and game stores and things like that, I think there's a pretty good chance you can find that they run D&D, and if you ask them about it there, you can find more information and potentially find an in-person group. And this is great because D&D is a fantastic way to make friends. Even if you don't know these people the first time you sit down at the table with them, it will probably only take you a few sessions for you to become friends. Of course, not everyone is going to get along automatically, but I have played D&D with some strangers I've become friends with. I've wound up really enjoying their company over time, even if all we really do is meet up for D&D. If you have like a more regularly scheduled D&D game, this is great because it is regularly scheduled friend time, especially if you're an otherwise busy person or you have a hard time seeing through plans. Playing D&D is a really good way to make sure you're getting out there and consistently seeing people. I think that's definitely one of the benefits to it, especially for me. The final thing to consider is your purpose in playing. The other things were sort of things you should consider to see if D&D is a good fit for you, but I think purpose is something that can help motivate you, even if you're struggling to understand the rules or struggling to find a group, because I think there are a ton of benefits to playing D&D, aside just from it being super fun. that isn't really talked about as much, and these are also some reasons I really consider everyone at least giving D&D a shot. Because it's true, it is not for everyone, but I think everyone should try it at some point, to be completely honest. Especially if you're into theater and things like that, it can really strengthen your acting skills, it can really strengthen your improv skills and help you think on the fly, and it can also help you learn to embody a character better. Role-playing is involved to some capacity, and of course this strengthens your acting, but it can also help you become more compassionate. In a lot of ways, some storylines can actually wind up being pretty therapeutic, especially if your character is going through a struggle that you sort of have as well and they're working through it. It can be a healing process. It can really sharpen your critical thinking skills, your problem solving skills. It is extremely fun, and I think if you're a creative person, it can really help strengthen that and help use it as an outlet. And if you're not so much a creative person, I think it can help you explore that side of yourself a little more. I'm a writer, and I'm literally writing a book about one of my NPCs. Aside from that, D&D is what has gotten me into cosplay, which is a huge love of mine now, because I wanted to cosplay my character Sylvester. I want to learn to animate because I want to animate scenes from my campaign. So many things: drawing, sewing, animating, designing, cosplaying. This has all stemmed from D&D. I think it is a huge source of creativity, a huge source of passion for me, and I think it can be for a lot of people. But it is also true, it can be hard to find people to play with, and it can be difficult to learn, and it can cost a lot of money and time that you might not have right now. I hope this video was of some help. I know Dungeons and Dragons can be difficult to get into, so I hope this video has helped you decide if it's a good fit for you and help you think about what you need to know before you decide to play. If you're interested in this and content like this, I make D&D and cosplay related videos along with just other dorky things that I am into. I have a cosplay Instagram account at wow__Mel. I hope you have a beautiful day, my precious everyone, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!